We are coming up on the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And as a person with disabilities, I have definitely experienced the positives of the Americans with Disabilities Act. But I also knew that if I didn't take the time to write down some of my thoughts, that I would not get them out well. So I'm going to read to you all some thoughts and observations of the Americans with Disabilities Act. My name is Susan Reynolds, and I am disabled. I was 12 years old when I received my first diagnoses of dyslexia and ADHD. As a child, I understood that I learned differently, but I received little to no accommodations in school. I was a frustrated child who longed for something better. Before the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the world was in such an interesting place. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. Less than a year later, in 1990, Germany was in the process of reunifying as a country. In the same year, the United States had passed the greatest piece of civil rights legislation since the 1964 Civil Rights Bill, the Americans with Disabilities Act. The U.S. became a beacon of hope for people with disabilities all over the world. I was 16 when the Americans with Disabilities Act passed, and I remember the day vividly. A few months earlier, before my 16th birthday, I was diagnosed with my second learning disability. I was a military kid. We were stationed in Germany, and a pediatric neurologist diagnosed me with a visual motor processing disorder. I was a teenager being diagnosed with a new disability. I was old enough to know that I learned differently. I was old enough to know that something wasn't working. I was old enough to know. It was July 1990, and I watched President George H.W. Bush speak about the Americans with Disabilities Act. I sat, stunned into silence, as he said the words, "This act is powerful in its simplicity. It will ensure that people with disabilities are given the basic guarantees for which they have worked so long and so hard: independence, freedom of choice, control of their lives, the opportunity to blend fully and equally into the rich mosaic of the American mainstream." Unexpectedly, the shame I felt, being a teenager on Ritalin, being a different learner, not being able to sit still like everyone else in school, it wasn't so shameful. ADA changed my life in a matter of minutes. The long-term effects, I didn't know about those yet. Buildings were now mandated to have ramps, elevators, and accessible bathrooms. Public transportation was to become accessible. My friends who require wheelchairs could get into a building and use a bathroom like everyone else. They had independence, freedom of choice, control of their lives, and they had opportunity to blend fully and equally into the rich mosaic that is the American mainstream. But ADA it was so much more than accessibility. ADA protected us against discrimination by public entities on the basis of disability. Being denied an IEP and 504 plan in elementary school and in high school made me fearful. I was worried and fearful about taking college entrance exams without accommodations. I was worried about college and my learning experience. But ADA would make sure that my college experience would be different. It would be accessible finally. Even more impressive was now college entrance exams were required to provide accommodations for students with learning disabilities. I was one of the first students in my high school to receive testing accommodations for the SAT. So what does ADA mean to me? ADA has been my comfort and reliable friend for 30 years. I received accommodations in college. I receive accommodations in the workplace. And I receive accommodations for when I advocate for my son's IEP in his school. ADA has always been there for me, and it has never let me down. But that doesn't mean we still don't have work to do regarding ADA, because unfortunately, there are still accessibility issues with buildings, with sidewalks, and in education. We still have work to do because the work for ADA is never done. And it's because of advocates, ADA will always be here for people with invisible and visible disabilities. ADA will always ensure that people with disabilities, all people with all disabilities, are treated equal under the law. I'd like to take this time to thank retired U.S. Senators Tom Harkin and Bob Dole for their vision, for their drive, and for their support of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I would like to thank Judith Heumann, Ed Roberts, Brad Lomax, and so many other advocates for their fierce advocacy of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I would like to thank the new generation of advocates. I would like to thank Alice Wong, Emily Ladow, and LaDerrick Horn for fiercely protecting the Americans with Disabilities Act. I am honored to join you in this work. So happy anniversary, Americans with Disabilities Act. You look so good for 30.